Thank you very much for coming. When I give a talk, when people give talks, they always say, it's great to be here, right? Wherever they are, and even if it's not that great to be here, but it really is great to be here. I came here a year ago, and I couldn't get in because it was the first morning of the lockdown, so I've been waiting nearly a year and a half to come back here. And it feels great. I walked around the exhibition this morning, and it really, I've seen it online, but unless you're here in person, you don't really get the power of it. I came to Derry about 30 years ago, first of all, to research a book which I wrote about the connections between the civil rights movements here and the civil rights movements in the US. I was aware at that time that there was some connection sort of in the 1960s and 70s. And I think that many of you will be very familiar with those connections. So I don't really want to talk too much about those tonight. I mean, I'm happy to if you want me to, but when I was researching, what I found was a surprise to me, and when I've been giving talks about it, both here and in America since, is that although people have a fairly good idea of the connections through the inspiration of Martin Luther King and the shared songs and some of the shared iconography and some of the shared tactics, both sides of the Atlantic, they didn't really know that much about the connections between the sort of 1850s and 1950s, so like 100 years really before the modern civil rights movement in the US took off. And so I'm not going to talk very long tonight, but I'd like to concentrate on that century or so before we get to the 1950s and 1960s. So the 1960s stuff clearly is everywhere. I took this picture of Belfast years ago, but I see that there's one of Martin Luther King just along the road here already. You see these here, you see these in Belfast. There's no point in me coming here and telling you what's in Derry, right? Some of the other stuff that people are more familiar with, the connections, those early 70s connections. When Bernadette Lukowski went to see Angela Davis in prison, Angela Davis was on charges of terrorism, kidnapping, in prison, was finally acquitted. But like Daniel O'Connell, I guess before her, 100 and more years ago, Bernadette really put it up to Irish America, like whose side are you on here? You know, you can't be racist in America and for rights in Ireland. And that was a big thing in the 1840s and 1850s in the US, as it started to tumble towards civil war around slavery. And of course in the US during the 1960s. In the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Philadelphia in 1969, the organisers said it would be all right for there to be a band saying in support of civil rights, as long as it made clear that the banner was in support of civil rights here and not in support of civil rights in America. Irish America has a very complicated relationship with the civil rights movement in the US, as you might know. Again, I don't really want to talk too much about the 60s and 70s unless you want me to later. Let's start here, which is an Irish American bar in Washington. It's called the Irish Times. And it has, when you walk in, it's just opposite the main train station, Union Station in Washington. And when you walk in, it has all of that usual paraphernalia of an Irish American bar, right? A lot of police and fire badges and images mixed in with a lot of Irish stuff and a lot of Irish American stuff, right? So mixed up on the walls you have pictures of the hunger strikers, of the Proclamation of the Republic, of, I think there's Pierce there, of James Joyce, there's pictures of Ronald Reagan up and around, there's pictures of John F. Kennedy, and then right at the top there, stuck up half behind the telly, is a picture of Frederick Douglass. I first saw that when I went to that pub in the mid-1980s, and I asked the fellow working behind the bar, why is that there? And he didn't know. And I've been back to that bar on and off over the last, how many years that is, maybe 40 years now. And unfortunately, anybody I've ever asked who works there doesn't know why Frederick Douglass is up there. But at some point, before 1984, someone had realised that Frederick Douglass belongs in that pantheon of great Irish American heroes. Frederick Douglass was a slave, and he escaped from slavery, actually at the suggestion of two Irish dockers who he met when he was a boy in Baltimore. They were unloading stuff on the dock, and they got chatting, and they said, "What do you mean you're a slave? You can't go where you want and do what you want." And he said, "No, I can't." And they said, "Why don't you just run away?" And he said that's the first time the idea had ever occurred to him. Anyway, long story, but years later, he escaped. He went to the north of the US. He came to Ireland in the 1840s and did a long speaking tour. He went to Britain too. He was in Cork, he was in Limerick, he was in Wexford, he was in Belfast, drumming up support for the abolition of slavery in the US. And he became pretty close. Pretty close to Daniel O'Connell, who at the time, of course, was looking for rights, particularly the rights to vote across Ireland. And they made common cause. They understood that the struggle that they were embarked on was very similar in many ways. And although O'Connell never went to the US, he wouldn't go on principle because of its slave-owning states. He challenged Irish America and turned down money from Irish America because he didn't want money that had come from slave owners or those who were sympathetic to slavery. So that was the 1840s. When I wrote this book 25 or more years ago, it wasn't unknown by other historians and other people who hadn't studied history that Frederick Douglass had come here. But when Obama came to Dublin, while he was president, he made a big deal of this connection and the legacy of Frederick Douglass. And I think that there's fairly mainstream now. You get all over Ireland Frederick Douglass monuments and streets and so on named after him. Douglass came back here when he was a very old man on honeymoon, I believe. He got married when he was quite old, and he came back here. And again, I think this Belfast, and you see the significance of the connection with Frederick Douglass. But let's skip on another generation. This is Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is actually from the Caribbean, and he spent some years in the early 1900s in London before going to New York and really established and developed a black nationalist power base in New York and across the US. He was the first real black national figure in terms of black nationalist politics, like the grandfather really of that movement, which came to fruition also in the 1950s and 1960s through Malcolm X. Malcolm X's parents met, actually both working for Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey, when he was in London in the early 1900s, saw the rise and the development of an Irish independence movement, particularly the Sinn Féin movement. And so, like other Caribbean radicals in London in those years, he started to go to protests for Irish independence, for Irish rights, and began to know some of the key figures in the early Sinn Féin movement. And in fact, he stole much of the tactics and the slogans and the vocabulary and the iconography of that early Sinn Féin movement when he set up his first black nationalist political organisation, the UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association. So he saw that Sinn Féin had produced a newspaper like that. He produced for his own organisation a newspaper almost identical to that, and he called it Our Own. Direct translation. And so when he set up the flag of this black nationalist organisation, he explained that the colours there were the red for the leftists, for the communists and socialists of the world, black for the black people of the world, and green in solidarity with the Irish. And this is still the Pan-Africanist political flag. In the early 1920s, was really at the peak of the popularity of his movement. He had a mass rally at Madison Square Gardens in 1921, and he sent off a series of telegrams to Terence McSweeney's priest, saying 400 million Negroes across the world support you in your struggle for Irish independence. And when McSweeney died, and there was a boycott by dockers in America of British cargo ships, many of those dockers were part of Garvey's organisation. Also in the 1920s, there was a cultural explosion in New York of black identity, of black art, of black literature, the Harlem Renaissance. And this, I mean, part of this was music too, big on the jazz scene, and some of the key players in the Harlem Renaissance also looked to Ireland and the Gaelic revival of the early 1900s and 1910s for their inspiration in terms of building a political identity out of an artistic identity. So the main magazine of the Harlem Renaissance was this magazine called The Survey, and in 1921 they had an edition devoted to the rise of, to the Gaelic revival, and they had Irish playwrights and writers writing this edition of the magazine about how you can build a political movement off the back of an artistic movement. Which brings us, skipping up to another generation here, to 1955. Often seen as the start of the modern civil rights era in the US. So Rosa Parks, as you all probably know, in 1955 refused to give up her place on the bus. And so, in protest of that, there was a non-violent mass movement of refusing to ride and pay fares on the buses, called the Montgomery Bus Boycott. So the tactic of the boycott was born, established, named in the 1880s here in the West of Ireland, where the land agent, Captain Boycott, was ostracised from the community. People wouldn't serve him in shops, they wouldn't speak to him, and they refused to hand over their rent to the English land agent. So the borrowing again of the vocabulary of one struggle from the other. In this example, they're borrowing from the American movement by the American movement of the Irish movement. There's another example here of how the boycotts was taken from one example and used in another. These are things that you're probably much more familiar with, this sort of direct. It says, there's a leaflet from the 1970s in the US trying to get people to join a march and sympathy for NICRA. You saw it in Selma, you saw it in Chicago, now take a look in Northern Ireland. I spoke to a couple of women from Martin Luther King's organisation, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. 3 delegates from their organisation came here, came to the north of Ireland anyway, 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday. And I don't know if they came to Derry. They came to Belfast. There's an annual general meeting of NICRA, and I assume that they had been booked to come some weeks before that. When I spoke to them, it would have been in the mid-1990s. They could remember bits and pieces about what happened that February 1972, but I don't know if they came here or not. But that exchange of people, whether it was from members of People's Democracy here going and meeting figures in the Black Panther movement, Bernadette Devlin was given the keys of New York, and she gave them back via Amy McCann, I believe, to the Black Panthers in New York. She was given the freedom of the city by the mayor of New York City. And so those exchanges have carried on, as I understand, over the years, also in the context of Bloody Sunday campaign. One last thing I want to just draw your attention to. So the Black Lives Matter movement was born, as you know, recently in the US, and this slowly appeared, and it captured much of what the struggle is about, and really became a global phenomenon. And then, not long ago, I was looking through some archives of photos from here, and I saw some pictures of a trade union march from 1974, and that caught my eye. Now, I don't think that the Black Lives Matter movement saw that and copied it, but I think that the vocabulary and the commonality between the two there is really, I guess what I'm trying to get at here, when I talk to people who were here during the 1960s and 1970s and talk about the inspiration from the Black Civil Rights movement in the US, whether it was the Martin Luther King side of it, or the Malcolm X side of it, or the Panthers, they saw some identification in what they were doing, but without really much knowledge usually of what happened before that, either with Marcus Garvey or with Frederick Douglass or the Harlem Renaissance or anything else. And so I think what happens isn't that generations, as far as I can see, really build on what's happened in previous generations, but they just sort of discover it all over again for themselves for the first time, but every 30 or 40 years. Now, what's happening now is a little different because of social media and so on, that, you know, the connections there between the Black Lives Matter groups and the groups here might be such a surprise for future activists, I guess. Okay, I guess that's all I wanted to say for now. I'm more than happy to answer questions or discuss, or if you want to get into the 1950s and 60s and 70s, fine, but I wanted to just give you some idea of very short summary of that 1850s to 1950s world. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Just a comment really, I was watching a programme at BBC just over the weekend on 100 years of partition. And for the most part it was quite predictable, as the same old historians saying the same old thing, but what I found new to me in it and interesting was the number of Indian historians on who spoke about how they were looking at Ireland as well in the revolutionary period and holding up Dabalura columns, people like that, as an inspiration for what they were working towards. So, you know, it's always interesting to see how Ireland has influenced, as well as taking influence from things all over the world.
I think that's right. I find, you know, when I talk to American academics, particularly, that when they talk about, well, I'm overgeneralising here, but when they talk about the transnationalism of the civil rights movement, generally what they mean is that the American civil rights movement was exported and influenced other parts of the world, and that's true, absolutely that's true. You see the Martin Luther King and Malcolm X stuff in Cairo, in Hong Kong, all over the world, right? But there's less understanding, I think, or less appreciation that there was also an influence that was flowing the other way across the Atlantic too. That, you know, the tactic, the word boycott, wasn't invented by the American civil rights movement, right? It was invented here. Some of that stuff that Marcus Garvey built on was really borrowed from here, and not just here. I mean, the Scandinavians also, in the progressive movement in the 1920s, had a big influence on the US progressivism. But I think it's good to get a sense that you know, nobody owns this stuff and then gives it or hands it over to another movement. I mean, the thing is flying backwards and forwards the whole time. I mean, some of the issues now around policing in the US and the issues that the Black Lives Matter struggle has, you know, are clearly reminiscent of what happened here, and whether there are things that can be learned by them from the experience here. I suspect so. But the impression often that I think people have is that the American Civil Rights Movement were the experts, and the rest of the world learned from them. And to some extent that's true, but the American Civil Rights Movement also learned a lot from the rest of the world, not least here.
I think Brian, I found your talk fascinating. I think most of us were aware that Douglass, for example, came to Ireland at some point in his life, or twice in fact. But it was fascinating just to see the links between him and O'Connell, and the stuff about slavery, of course, has a very contemporary ring about it. And Daniel O'Donnell, who is often portrayed as a sort of Catholic reactionary, clearly well ahead of his time, and a figure that we can actually relate to and admire. The point I wanted to make was, obviously, you concentrate quite rightly on the links between Ireland and American civil rights, but there's also, the whole Irish connection with liberation struggles generally, I think is often, people are often surprised to realise that Mahatma Gandhi was profoundly influenced by what happened here. Now, Gandhi's not the most popular of figures because of all his religiosity and so on, which is obviously not very 21st century. But he was profoundly influenced by people like Arthur Griffith, by the first oil, the Indian flag, modelled on the Irish tricolour. Yeah. So, there's a whole lot of research that could usefully be done. In fact, the other day I was watching a lecture on a guy called Bhagat Singh, who was a kind of alternative to Gandhi in India. He believed in the armed struggle, and he was hanged by the British in Lahore in 1931. Now he named his organisation the Indian Republican Socialist Association in a very direct link to Connolly. And the reason I mention this is because the guy who's talking about Bhagat Singh went through his whole lecture and didn't mention this at all. And I raised it as a question, and he agreed that the sort of Irish connection between or influence on Indian struggle for freedom was very, very significant.
I see. Much of my work nowadays is working with human rights activists in various countries around the world, and many of the questions I get asked are about good examples and also mistakes to be avoided from various contexts: the anti-apartheid movement, the American Civil Rights Movement, and also the Irish struggle for rights. And I get asked a lot around the tactic of hunger striking. It's seen as something, I don't know about necessarily totally successful here, but certainly that there is something of value in that tactic that people want to learn from. And yet, Daniel O'Connell, like most big, influential, even good guys in history, like super mixed and layered and all of that, but on slavery he really was adamant and disowned Irish America, much to damage of his own political movement in Ireland because of ties with slavery. And on the other hand, then you had an Irish nationalist hero like John Mitchell, who was a big supporter of the Confederacy, had some crackpot idea that Ireland could be free and populated by slaves. But anyway, yeah, O'Connell was on the right side of that, on the right side of history, and was really very influential. And with Douglass, I think, gave cover to Irish Americans that it was all right to be anti-slavery, right? And yet, after that, then you had the history of Irish America, many Irish Americans being in law enforcement. You see that in the Irish pub there, the badges and the iconography of New York the NYPD or the Chicago police or the Boston police, or whatever, often then being seen as on the wrong side of the civil rights movement. You know, in 1968, it's Irish American Mayor Daley, you know, who is confronting Martin Luther King. The FBI agents who run the Informer program within the Black Panther movement are Irish guys. I think Fitzpatrick is one of them. So they're just seeing Kathleen Cleaver, one of the Black Panthers, said to me, you know, we just saw too many cops with Irish names who were the enemy, and that's slightly unfair. You know, that's not all of Irish America, but that stereotype of being against racial justice and racist, I mean that's earned, that's there for a reason. It's certainly not all Irish Americans, and plenty really amazing exceptions of Irish American showing solidarity with the African American struggle in the 60s and 70s. But yeah, the general stereotype, I think, is there for a reason.
Brian, you see that church up there on the walls? Dark brown.
I do, yeah.
That was John Mitchell's dad was the minister of that church.
Is that right?
First Derry Presbyterian.
Right. I think it was the dad, maybe John Mitchell, I think it was the dad that ran a newspaper produced a newspaper in the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, throughout those Civil War years. Okay, thanks all very much. I didn't want to keep you very long. Hope the experiment worked with all the various tech. Thanks very much, Kieran.
Before you go, are you moving on with that work from the book that you wrote all those years ago to add in this whole aspect? Now, is there more that we can point people towards? Is there? So
the book came out in '98, I think, and then a couple of years ago I did a sort of an updated essay on it, which is on the web, to say a few things. First of all, just, you know, some things that happened since '98 and 2018 or whatever it was. You know, Obama coming in was a big one, right? But then there are also things which I just didn't know about from 1840 up to 1998, and a lot more material now is available than it was 25 years ago. You get fantastic oral histories, that you can just get online. That I couldn't. I mean, the internet hadn't been invented when I wrote that book, but it was pretty much in its infancy. But now there's just so much more in terms of resources. There's an online an oral history archive, I think the University of Mississippi, I believe, and they had a fantastic interview with an Irish priest who was based in the US South. It was really very close to Martin Luther King, and I didn't know this guy existed, and he talks also about that shared solidarity, the shared struggle. There was a great priest too, one of my Irish American good guy priests in the civil rights movement in the US, Father Eugene Boyle in San Francisco. His was the first place to open the church hall, the community hall, for the first Black Panther free breakfast program, and let the Panthers hold political meetings there. Huey Newton was obviously Huey Newton was on murder charge. He flew across the country to stand up for it. I think in terms of the next chapter, so to speak, in this, it's more what Robin was talking about. It's not just about those two contexts. Yeah. It's about what about the influence on the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa? What about the influence on what's happening now in Palestine? I mean, you look out here, right? I mean, it's Palestinian flags that you see everywhere. It's as much or more than BLM iconography. So I think, there are many more dots for us to join.
I don't know if I mentioned this to them on Kira. I laughed the day of internment. There was bad lighting everywhere. There was bad lighting up in Westwood and Craig. And for whatever reason, I don't know why it was, the crowd was chanting "Ho Ho Ho Chi Minh." That's the riot. I'm sure that the Brits are kind of going, "Who's Ho Chi Minh?" You know.
Yeah.
Well, of course, it was years later that I found out that Ho Chi Minh, as far as I know, had attended Terence McSweeney's funeral. He was
I think that's right.
Yeah.
He worked in London, I know.
He worked in London,
somewhere.
he came over to the funeral, and we were at Cork last year. There was a fantastic exhibition about the War of Independence and such at Cork, and part of the exhibition was the reaction to McSweeney's death worldwide, and that's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. In Italy, in Catalonia, and elsewhere throughout the world, there was a kind of massive reaction.
Yeah, and Mark Scully too.
Yeah.
Can I raise something else, Brian, perhaps of a more controversial nature?
What about?
The comparison and linkage between civil rights America and civil rights Ireland is often seen as being personified in the figure of John Hume. And John Hume is often described as the Martin Luther King of the North. Now, I personally think the comparison is completely wrong, that you cannot actually think of two more different figures than John Hume and Martin Luther King. I'll give you the reasons why very briefly. To begin with, at a very superficial level, Martin Luther King went to prison. Hume didn't. Hume ended up trying to stop demonstrations, whereas Martin Luther King was all for organising more and to widen the struggle out from civil rights into economic rights. Martin Luther King never once stood for political office. I'm not saying that he wouldn't have encouraged African Americans to do that. I'm sure he probably would have. But having said that, he didn't himself. And I suppose more interestingly, the older King became, the more radical he became.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't think one can say any of that about John Hume. Now, I'm not knocking John Hume. I think John Hume is a historically important figure, and he made a huge contribution to the peace process. And we shouldn't underestimate that. It's just that it knocks me when people say he was the Martin Luther King, because he wasn't. Well, would you care to comment?
Yeah, I'd say that, I suppose the now sanitised version of Martin Luther King, which generally gets presented, certainly at schools in the US and Britain, really wasn't Martin Luther King either. I mean, Martin Luther King is frozen in a lot of history in sort of an August 1963, I Have a Dream type frame, right? But he developed enormously over the next 5 years until he was assassinated, and really, as you said, became much more radical, much more critical of US imperialism and US violence, much more tied in around issues of poverty. So I'm not trying to dodge your question at all, but like if you're comparing anyone with Martin Luther King, you sort of need to try and figure out, first of all, which Martin Luther King is it that you're comparing to. And I don't think those things work generally anyway. You know, in 2011, when there were those Arab revolutions across North Africa, much of the Middle East, I was in Washington working then, and very facile questions that many American government officials would say, well, where's the Martin Luther King figure in all of this? And it just doesn't work like that, right? It didn't work like that really for the American Civil Rights Movement either. I mean, there was no one civil rights organisation. You know, you had Kings, you had a lot of local stuff all across the country. You had SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, roughly comparable to PD here, a much younger, often more radical agenda. John Lewis was a big figure in that there. So I think there are commonalities in terms of, particularly around actually divisions within movements, often around gender, often around age, often around activists in big cities as opposed to in rural places, often around activists who are religious and those who aren't. I think comparing this league with that league doesn't really work across the movements. So I don't think you're right to compare John Hume with Martin Pym, I think we like to compare John Hume with, I don't know, Austin Curry or Vernon Pascal. It just doesn't really work that way. Or Malcolm X with any of those figures either. The context's too different in that sense.
Could I ask more sort of contemporary question? With the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in the States, and the apparent shift within the Jewish community with regard to the Israeli sort of Palestine ongoing oppression and conflict. Do you think that is there something peculiar going on in the States at the moment, and do you think it will lead to something more concrete, more durable, in a sort of US or national politics?
I do think something peculiar is going on.
Yeah.
I don't really know what it is yet, but I think that mainstream US politics and its view towards Israel is different than it was 3 years ago. I don't know how that will play out, and I really especially here, don't want to oversimplify what happened here in the 90s. But one of the pieces of the jigsaw that moved here, and in the context of the Troubles, was Irish American, right? And the Irish diaspora in America decided that it would have a different look at what's happening here. And not to try to stretch that notion too far, but I think when the diaspora in the US and the Jewish community in the US, I think are beginning to take a bit of a different look at what happens in Israel and Palestine, and that just may be a smallish shift, but I do think that could unlock something pretty fast. Yeah. I don't think those comparisons are identical, but I do think there's something there. You have a major force there which is sort of rooted in its belief, doesn't really change, and then when it does shift just a little bit, then it can unlock a much bigger picture. Yeah.
The tragedy is, in a way, that the Jewish community is very small in America, and any changes within it, repercussions. I mean, it's the Christian evangelicals who are the ones who are really backing Israel, not Jewish community. I mean, there are Jews obviously who do.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, really, I'm not an expert on this at all, but from what I read, the views of young people in America, are very different, including young people in the Jewish community in America, are really shifting now. And you see it in a little bit in the Democratic Party over what happened last month. Not a radical shift, but certainly, things were being said critical of Israel, critical of the US administration's response, which weren't said 3, 5, certainly 10 years ago. So yeah, something peculiar is shifting, whether it's seismic or not, whether it's temporary or not, I don't know. But it looks to me like a different flavour from a decade ago.
And just a follow-up question, again, it's contemporary and the obviously policing is organised very, very differently in the States than it is practically anywhere else in the world, but and it's sort of organised sort of state by state.
Or even more local than that.
And there's local county as well. Is there any shift or is there anything happening stateside around the organisation of policing as a result of the various tragedies that have occurred in the last number of years alone? And do you think if there is, will it actually lead to something?
I don't see that there is much of a reorganisation, and I don't think that the reorganisation which I think will be needed is necessarily only about ideology. I mean, I see a huge amount of waste and duplication in police forces. That every town has got its own police force, and surely like a centralised system with more uniform standards, and it's just cheaper, right, to be able to do that. So I don't see that shifting, because there's a lot of small-scale vested interests there, people not wanting to give up the local power that they have. But certainly you see nationally a change in perception of policing over the last couple of years. You know, defunding the police has been a ridiculously impossible request to make 6-8 years ago. And for it to be taken seriously-ish is a big shift. Yeah, but you know, although you have those forces for reform, you also have very, as we know, powerful countervailing forces. And Irish America also is, again, you know, a big piece of this, right? Traditionally seen as non-reformist on these sorts of issues. One of the reactionary forces, I guess, in the US police is around the militarisation of the police, where they're getting equipment and a military mindset, which is unhelpful. So, you've got both things going on at once. But I would say I'm pretty optimistic, actually, that American policing is likely to be in a better place 10 years from now than it was. I mean, one big shift in American policing happened during the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s in 1967, of wide-scale riots across the US. Big national commission to investigate it, put the blame, some of the blame at least, on systematic police racism. Shot that in 1968 for that to be said. And some police forces did make an effort in the early 70s, particularly to diversify their personnel. And I think that they, we thought that was sort of the answer. Turns out it's not really. You can still have an unfair police force, even if it's got a lot of people of colour in it, right? It's the culture and the system that works here. So yeah, well, I guess it's probably wrong to characterise it like that, but we may be on the verge of like a second wave of police reform, if we count that late 60s, early 70s as the first wave, which was really about all that time, getting the police force to reflect the community it serves, meaning more African American police officers. That wasn't a bad thing at all, but it didn't solve the problem of the system. And I guess here it would be interesting to compare it to here too, with the different demographics in the police over the last generation. Clearly hasn't solved all the problems.
That's all, isn't it?
Right, it was really interesting. Talking, I was familiar enough with the 50s and 60s, but not the 100 years previous. But one of the things that's always interested me, obviously, if Santino's here, you've Che Guevara as a mural, and I was in Chile back in 2008 backpacking. And I had a right laugh at the fact nearly every street is named after a fellow called Bernardo O'Higgins.
Yes, yeah.
Helped to liberate Chile at the time. When you were doing your research for this, did you come across much commonality with South America and some of the kind of revolutionary movements in South America and Ireland, as well as somewhere else?
I didn't, and only because I didn't really look at that. Yeah. But yes, there's plenty there, and whether somebody has already, very possibly, if they haven't, they should, because again, that Irish influence on whatever we call it, struggles for rights or revolutionary movements, absolutely swept right through Latin America too.
It was interesting when you saw half of the capital of that South American city named after me.
Yeah, that's right. All right, thanks once again. Thanks very much for coming, and hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran.